You think you know the Civil War? You know the monumental battles, Gettysburg, Antietam, Vicksburg. You know the names, Lincoln, Grant, Lee. But the entire fate of the Confederacy, the crucial lifeline that sustained its armies, rested on a fragile line of rusting iron tracks running through the dark green heart of Georgia. And on a frigid spring morning in 1862, a small, reckless band of men, disguised as civilians and led by a shadowy figure of ambiguous loyalties, was about to attempt the impossible. To steal the most vital tool of the Southern war machine, a magnificent, unstoppable iron horse, and burn the Confederacy to the ground from the inside out. Chapter 1, The Fixer and the Fatal Plan. The air in the makeshift Union camp near Shelbyville, Tennessee, was thick with the mud and the smell of pine smoke in March 1862. Major General Ormsby McKnight Mitchell, a flamboyant, visionary astronomer turned military commander, was obsessed. His objective was Chattanooga, Tennessee, the gateway to the South. If the Union could seize that nexus of rail and river, the Confederacy's western supply chain would snap. But between Mitchell and Chattanooga lay 150 miles of fiercely defended Confederate territory, anchored by the Western and Atlantic Railroad, W&A. It was this railroad, connecting Atlanta to Chattanooga, that ferried the food, ammunition, and reinforcements that kept the Confederate forces in Tennessee alive. Attacking it head-on was suicide. It needed to be severed, utterly destroyed from within. James J. Andrews, the man of shadows. Into this high-stakes calculus stepped James J. Andrews. Andrews was a civilian scout, a man whose past was as murky as a swamp fog. He was a Kentuckian, a supposed Union man, yet he had traveled freely behind Confederate lines, claiming to be a blockade runner, a speculator, even a cotton buyer. He was tall, handsome, and carried an air of effortless, dangerous charm. He was a man with a talent for blending in, for asking the right questions, and for listening. General Mitchell, a man of daring ideas, saw in Andrews a crucial, if unreliable, tool. Andrews had been observing the W&A, taking mental notes on train schedules, bridge locations, and guard postings. On a late evening in Mitchell's tent, illuminated by a single sputtering oil lamp, Andrews laid out his audacious plan. It was simple in concept, terrifying in execution, infiltrate. 24 men, including himself, all dressed in civilian clothes, would slip through enemy lines and travel in small groups to Marietta, Georgia, posing as Kentuckians making their way to join the Confederate forces, or as common laborers. Seize the engine. They would board the regular northbound train from Atlanta at Marietta, ride it to an isolated stop called Big Shanty, now Kennesaw. And there, while the passengers and crew were at breakfast, they would steal the locomotive, the path of destruction. Driving the stolen train north toward Chattanooga, the raiders would tear up track, cut telegraph wires, and, most critically, burn the covered wooden bridges that spanned the rivers and ravines. The destruction of one or two key bridges would halt all rail traffic for months. With their supply lines severed, the Confederate Army in Tennessee would be starved into retreat, allowing Mitchell's forces to sweep in and seize Chattanooga without firing a shot. It was a strategy of sabotage so profound, it promised to shorten the war itself. Mitchell, after a tense pause, gave the nod. The fate of his campaign, and perhaps the whole Western theater, was now tied to the raw courage of 24 Ohio soldiers and one enigmatic civilian. The volunteers, ordinary men for an extraordinary task. Andrews needed men of iron nerve, men who knew railroad work, and men who understood the stakes. The penalty for a captured spy was death by hanging. He found his volunteers primarily in the 2nd, 21st, and 33rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry Regiments. They were farmers, blacksmiths, carpenters, and, crucially, 3 former railroad workers, Wilson Brown, Martin Hawkins, and William Knight, whose expertise was vital for operating the stolen engine. The men were told the mission was dangerous and top secret, but not its full scope, lest the information fall into enemy hands. They received their instructions. Travel light, avoid suspicion, and meet at the Lacey Hotel in Marietta on the evening of the 11th of April, 1862. They were given money for the fare and told to carry no official Union documents or insignia. They were, for all intents and purposes, ghosts behind enemy lines. Chapter 2. Big Shanty and the Stolen General. The night of April 11th was clear and cold. The raiders, having made their precarious journeys in 2s and 3s, dodging Confederate patrols, answering sharp questions from suspicious locals, and sleeping in haystacks, arrived in Marietta. They congregated in small groups, exchanging only knowing glances, adopting the swagger and loose talk of Southern laborers. The tension was a living thing in the small town. The morning of the heist, Saturday, the 12th of April, 1862. The town of Big Shanty, Georgia, now Kennesaw, was little more than a station house, a water tank, a telegraph office, and a scattering of homes situated right next to a sprawling Confederate military encampment. It was an audacious, almost suicidal place to choose for the operation. At approximately 6 a.m., the northbound passenger train, scheduled from Atlanta to Chattanooga, arrived at Big Shanty. Its name, emblazoned in gold leaf, was the General, a magnificent 440 American-type locomotive, a powerful Rogers engine. It was one of the W&A's fastest and most reliable. The train stopped for its scheduled 45-minute breakfast break. The conductor, William A. Fuller, a man renowned for his vigilance and ferocious devotion to his railroad, led his passengers and most of his crew into the station dining room. This was the moment. The train crew had, as usual, left the engine uncoupled from the rest of the train to take on water, with a head of steam ready. Andrews gave a silent signal. 20 men, 2 of the original 22, had missed the rendezvous, slipped from their passenger cars, and moved with the practiced stealth of soldiers. Andrews, William Campbell, an experienced engineer, and the railroaders among them, climbed aboard the locomotive. The others quickly detached the 3 boxcars immediately behind. The General, these cars contained crucial tools, timber and iron for track repair, which the raiders planned to use to block their inevitable pursuit. The remaining passenger and freight cars were left behind, now a useless anchor. A Confederate sentry, a young private, stood less than 50 yards away, gazing lazily at the encampment, his attention clearly focused on the promise of breakfast. He saw the men board the engine, but assumed they were the relief crew. With a hiss of steam and a slow, almost gentle lurch, the General began to move. Andrews stood on the platform, his face a mask of determination, watching the sleeping camp and the dining room full of oblivious Confederates recede into the morning haze. No shots fired, no alarm raised. The first and most dangerous part of the mission was a stunning success. The pursuit begins a conductor's fury. Conductor William Fuller had just begun his breakfast eggs, ham, and grits when he heard the unmistakable sound of his locomotive pulling away, its whistle and impudent shriek down the line. Fuller bolted from the dining room, followed by his engineer, Jeff Kane, and Anthony Murphy, the master mechanic of the W&A. Seeing the engine, the 3 boxcars, and 20 strange men rapidly vanishing, a cold, hard fury took hold of Fuller. To lose a train, especially the General, was a stain on his professional honor that no mere war could excuse. They had no horses, no train of their own, and no time. Fuller, Kane, and Murphy started running. This was the beginning of one of the most incredible chases in American history. They ran down the track, through the silent camp, propelled by pure adrenaline and the unshakable certainty that the loss of the General meant the loss of their railroad. For 2 miles they ran, their lungs burning, their civilian clothes soaked in sweat, until they reached a section gang's workshop. There, they found a small, primitive, 4-wheeled handcar. They commandeered it, throwing their full weight into pumping the handle, driving the little car north, determined to chase down the fastest locomotive on the line. The great locomotive chase had begun. Chapter 3. A duel of iron and will. Andrews and his raiders, speeding away from Big Shanty, knew their lead was temporary. They stopped a few miles north and quickly severed the telegraph wire, cutting the Confederacy's main nervous system along the line. This was crucial. No warning could be sent ahead to Chattanooga. They passed through Ackworth and Allatoona, pulling to the side at scheduled passing points as if they were running a normal, delayed express. This demanded an agonizing balance. They had to move fast enough to outrun pursuit, but slowly enough to maintain the pretense of a routine run and avoid suspicion in the small towns. Their first critical sabotage came near the town of Etowah. The raiders managed to stop and rip up a section of track before a sharp turn, believing this would derail or at least halt any immediate pursuit. They then sped on, their true objective, the covered wooden bridges still ahead. The handcar, the Yonah, and the Texas. Fuller and his two companions, in the meantime, were demonstrating an almost superhuman dedication. The handcar was slow, but it covered ground. It was only stopped when it reached the section of track the raiders had destroyed. Fuller and his men, exhausted but undaunted, abandoned the mangled handcar and continued on foot. They ran for miles, until they reached Etowah, a small station where a yard engine, the Yonah, was sitting. This was their first stroke of luck. They commandeered the Yonah and, with Fuller at the throttle and a new burst of hope, they were back in the chase. The raiders, unaware of Fuller's tenacious pursuit, reached their next stop at Kingston. This was a nightmare. The rail yard was jammed with southbound freight trains awaiting passage. Andrews, bluffing his authority, managed to maneuver his stolen train through the congestion, citing urgent military necessity. The delay, however, was fatal, nearly an hour lost in a critical race against time. Fuller, on the Yonah, arrived at the same spot only minutes later. Seeing the tangled yard, he abandoned the slow-moving engine and found his ultimate prize, the powerful northbound freight engine Texas, which had just arrived from Chattanooga. Fuller and his crew made a desperate decision. They reversed the Texas, running the engine in reverse tender first at full speed. This was extremely dangerous, but it meant they didn't have to waste time turning the locomotive around. The chase had now escalated into a genuine high-speed rail duel. The Texas, running backward, was gaining rapidly on the General. Chapter 4: The Sabotage That Failed. As the two locomotives roared through the Georgia countryside, the chase became an epic of steam, smoke, and sheer willpower. Andrews' men began their sabotage in earnest. They would stop, jump off, and attempt to tear up a rail or set fire to a boxcar to block the line. Asterisk. The track-tearing fiasco, Andrews' raiders used their iron bars to pry up a rail behind them. It was a successful destruction of a section of track, but the pursuing Texas, running tender first, had its cowcatcher behind the engine. Fuller was forced to have his men jump off and remove the severed rail, which cost time but did not derail him. Asterisk. The boxcar incendiary. The raiders decided to uncouple one of their remaining boxcars, set it on fire, and leave it on a bridge they had just crossed, hoping the flames would spread to the wooden structure. However, it had rained heavily the night before. The boxcar fire sputtered and failed to ignite the wet wooden bridge. Fuller, arriving shortly after, simply had the burning car uncoupled and pushed onto a sidetrack. Andrews' plan hinged on destroying the major bridges, particularly the two colossal spans over the Oostenaula and Chickamauga rivers. But the delays at Kingston, the failure of the wet boxcar to burn, and Fuller's relentless, almost maniacal pursuit meant they never had enough time to properly prepare the critical bridges for ignition. By the time the raiders passed through Ringgold, Georgia, the General was running on fumes. The long journey and the frantic speed had burned through their wood and water supply. The boiler pressure was dropping, the speed was flagging, and they could now hear the deep, furious whistle of the Texas right behind them. Chapter 5: The End of the Line. The final leg of the chase was a heartbreaking race against physics for the raiders. The General was coughing smoke, its wheels slipping on the damp rails. Andrews knew the mission was over. The bridges were safe. His men were exhausted, and capture was imminent. Near the small village of Graysville, the firebox of the General finally gave out. The engine sputtered to a halt. Andrews gave the final, chilling order. Every man for himself. The 20 exhausted Union men scattered into the dense, confusing forest of North Georgia. Their mission a failure. Their fate now solely dependent on their own desperate survival skills. Within days, all 22 raiders, the original 24 minus the 2 who missed the train, plus the 20 who escaped, were hunted down by Confederate militias, bloodhounds, and furious locals. Their civilian clothing was useless. Their story of being Kentuckians joining the Confederate Army fell apart under intense interrogation.
The consequences, spies and heroes. The true astonishment of the great locomotive chase came not just from the adventure, but from its severe and tragic aftermath, and the enduring legacy of the men involved. The trials and executions, The raiders were not treated as ordinary prisoners of war, but as spies and saboteurs in civilian attire. James J. Andrews was the first to be tried and convicted. On June 7, 1862, he was hanged in Atlanta. He went to the gallows with composure, refusing to betray his Union contacts. 7 other raiders were quickly tried and followed Andrews to the gallows on June 18, 1862. Their bodies were reportedly buried in a mass, unmarked grave, only later to be properly recovered and reinterred. The Great Escape. The remaining 14 prisoners, terrified by the fate of their comrades, were imprisoned in the notorious Confederate prison at Castle Thunder in Richmond. 8 of them, including the former railroad engineer William Pittenger, orchestrated a brilliant and harrowing escape. They overpowered their guards, scaled the high prison walls, and split into small groups, enduring a brutal march through hundreds of miles of swamp and forest. One group, after weeks of starvation and near-death encounters, managed to row a salvaged boat out to sea and were picked up by a patrolling Union gunboat. Another group successfully crossed the Ohio River back into Union territory. 6 men were recaptured and remained prisoners until they were exchanged in March 1863. The legacy, the first medals of honor. When the escaped and exchanged raiders finally returned to the North, their incredible, near-fatal mission became a national sensation. On March 25, 1863, the 6 surviving soldiers who had been held captive and exchanged, including William Pittenger and William Knight, were summoned to Washington, D.C. Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton presented them with a brand new award, one that had been created only a few months prior to recognize exceptional valor, the Congressional Medal of Honor. Jacob Parrott, one of the recaptured men who had endured horrific torture by his Confederate captors to keep his silence, was the first recipient of the medal ever to receive it in person. The great locomotive chase, though a military failure, was a moral and patriotic triumph. The men of the general were the first Army recipients of the nation's highest military decoration. The engines themselves became relics. The general was eventually displayed in Kennesaw, Georgia, while the Steadfast Texas found its home in Atlanta. The tracks and bridges, though ultimately spared, were forever etched into the memory of the war, a monument to the near miss that could have crippled the Confederacy. The tale of Andrews' Raiders is not just a high-stakes adventure. It is a profound lesson in the nature of war, espionage, and the extraordinary courage of ordinary American men who, for a single morning, transformed a routine train track into a battlefield of eye.
Chapter 6. The Mechanics of Madness. The pursuit was not just a clash of men, but a violent duel between 3 locomotives, the General, the Yonah, and the Texas, each engine defining a phase of the chase. Understanding the technology of the 440 American-type locomotive is crucial to grasping the near impossibility of Conductor Fuller's success. The power of the American standard. All 3 engines were classic American type, meaning they had a 4-wheel lead truck, 4 driving wheels, and no trailing wheels designated as 440. This configuration was the workhorse of the era, balancing speed, traction, and stability. The General, the Quarry, asterisk, built by the Rogers, Ketchum, and Grosvenor firm in Paterson, New Jersey, in 1855, asterisk. It was a classic, handsome engine built for passenger service, meaning it was geared for speed. Its larger driving wheels, around 60 inches in diameter, allowed it to cover more distance per revolution, making it inherently faster than a freight engine once it was moving. Asterisk. The flaw. Andrews' crew, having uncoupled all but 3 boxcars, was running a light load, which was advantageous for speed. However, they were not experienced firemen or engineers. They burned through their tenders wood and water at an unsustainable rate. Maintaining the precise boiler pressure needed for peak performance was a complex art that required experience the raiders simply lacked. The Yonah, the stopgap. Asterisk A, small, aging yard engine. The Yonah was the first locomotive Fuller commandeered. It was designed for slow, heavy work shunting cars, not high-speed pursuit. Asterisk. It had small driving wheels and low power. It served only to move Fuller rapidly enough to reach the next station with the proper engine. If the chase had relied on the Yonah, Andrews would have succeeded easily. The Texas, the Hunter, asterisk, built by the Danforth Locomotive and Machine Company, The Texas was also a 440, but it was generally used for freight hauling. Its driving wheels were slightly smaller, prioritizing torque and pulling power over sheer top speed. Asterisk, the advantage. The Texas had a large, fully stocked tender when Fuller seized it at Kingston. It was full of wood and water, which meant it could maintain steam pressure longer than the desperate general. Asterisk, the audacity of reverse. Fuller's decision to run the Texas in reverse tender first was brilliant but reckless. Locomotives were designed to run with the large, pointed cowcatcher facing forward to clear debris and livestock. Running backward at 40 to 50 miles per hour was terrifyingly unstable. The only way Fuller maintained control was by leaning out of the cab, exposed to the elements, trusting his engineer to watch the boiler pressure, the duel of wood and water. The limiting factor in the chase wasn't the speed of the engines, but the fuel supply and the integrity of the boiler pressure. The Raiders' plan required stopping frequently to tear up track and burn bridges, which meant repeatedly dumping steam pressure to slow down and then using massive amounts of fuel to build it back up again. Fuller, running a powerful, well-fueled freight engine in reverse, did not have to stop at all. His constant, unrelenting pressure on the throttle forced Andrews into a race of attrition. Every time the general slowed down, the momentum of the heavy Texas devoured the distance between them. Crucially, when the Raiders tried to slow Fuller by dropping the last of their 3 boxcars, which they had soaked with oil and set alight, the Texas rammed the burning car. The impact knocked the burning vehicle off the track, but the solid construction of the old iron horse absorbed the blow. Fuller's relentless movement meant Andrews could not buy the critical time needed to properly demolish the covered bridges. The chase ended not because of a crash, but because the general starved. Its firebox was empty, the water level was dangerously low, and the boiler pressure simply faded away, leaving the magnificent engine inert on the rails near Ringgold. The victory belonged to the logistics and sheer tenacity of the crew on the Texas. Chapter 7. The Manhunt and the Southern Fury. When Andrews' Raiders scattered into the wilderness of northwest Georgia, they entered a landscape hostile and unforgiving. The failure of the raid meant their fate was sealed the moment they abandoned the engine, mobilizing the Confederacy. The moment Conductor Fuller reached Ringgold, the alarm was finally raised via the functioning telegraph lines that Andrews' men had failed to cut in time. The reaction was instantaneous and immense. Asterisk, local militias and home guard. Every small town in the area mobilized its local defense force, composed of older men and boys unfit for the front lines. Asterisk, civilian hunters. The locals were enraged. The notion of northern spies attempting to destroy their vital supply line fueled a righteous anger. The raiders were foreigners, saboteurs, and thieves. Asterisk, bloodhounds. The most effective trackers were the local hunters and their specialized bloodhounds, often called Negro dogs in contemporary accounts, trained to follow human scent over long distances. The raiders, exhausted and starving, made 2 crucial errors. Asterisk, they traveled as individuals or in pairs, making them easy targets for the organized search parties. Asterisk, they possessed no knowledge of the dense, swampy, mountainous terrain known locally as the Ridge and Valley Appalachians. The interrogation and exposure, within a week, all 22 men were captured. They were often found hiding in haystacks, barns, or trying to cross swollen creeks. The identity of the men as Union soldiers from Ohio regiments was quickly confirmed, stripping them of any pretense of being civilian blockade runners. This solidified their status in the eyes of the Confederate authorities as spies and marauders subject to immediate military tribunal. The chief prosecutor, Colonel Shaler G. Hillier, used the trials not just to punish the men, but to send a clear message to the Union. Sabotage behind the lines would be met with swift and brutal justice. The tragedy of Andrews and the gallows. James J. Andrews was the most enigmatic figure and the first victim. His trial focused heavily on his ambiguous past and his role as the civilian leader. He maintained a stoic demeanor throughout, offering little resistance or information. On the 7th of June, 1862, he was hanged in Atlanta. His death was drawn out, designed to be a deterrent. Less than 2 weeks later, 7 more men, those identified as having been most active or whose previous civilian status made their military role less clear, were taken to the gallows. Among them was William Campbell, the makeshift engineer. The execution of these men was a desperate act of war. They were seen as threats to the stability of the Confederacy. For the surviving raiders, now imprisoned in the notorious Castle Thunder in Richmond, the sound of the gallows being built elsewhere in the city was a constant, terrifying reminder of their own precarious existence. It was this fear of imminent execution that drove their daring escape attempt. Chapter 8: Castle Thunder and the Breakout. The remaining 14 raiders were transferred to Castle Thunder, a converted tobacco warehouse in Richmond, Virginia, that served as a holding facility for Union prisoners, spies, and Confederate military offenders. Life in the citadel of spies. Conditions in Castle Thunder were grim. Overcrowding, disease, and starvation were rampant. But the greatest psychological pressure on the raiders was the knowledge that their status as spies made them likely candidates for the next round of executions. The mastermind, the man who emerged to lead the escape, was William Pittenger, a 20-year-old schoolteacher from the 2nd Ohio, who was known for his sharp intellect and calm under pressure. He meticulously planned the escape with Wilson Brown, one of the actual railroad workers, and Daniel Allen. The Great Escape, November 1862. The opportunity came in late November, during a major prisoner transfer and a temporary lapse in vigilance by the guards. Asterisk: the overpowering. On a prearranged signal, the raiders moving in the dark overpowered their immediate guards. They were forced to use brutal, silent force, knowing that a single outcry would bring hundreds of guards. Asterisk: the walls, the greatest obstacle was the high, brick perimeter wall of the warehouse. They used a crude rope fashioned from blankets and torn sheets secured by a heavy piece of timber found in the warehouse. Asterisk: the dash for freedom. The raiders went over the wall in small groups, with one group dropping a terrifying 50 feet to the street below. Miraculously, no one was seriously injured. Once outside, the 14 men immediately split into small groups of 2 and 3. This was a lesson learned from their initial capture. Smaller groups were harder to track. The journey of desperation. The journey back to the Union lines in West Virginia and Tennessee was a saga of individual heroism and profound suffering. Asterisk: Pittenger's group. Pittenger and his companions traveled mostly at night, hiding during the day. They relied on the North Star for direction and begged for food from isolated farmhouses, taking immense risks. They spent weeks traversing the rugged Alleghenies. Asterisk: the river escape. The most dramatic escape was pulled off by 2 men, John Wallam and Daniel Allen, who reached the Chickahominy River. They found an abandoned flatboat, salvaged it, and managed to navigate the cold, treacherous waterways to the Chesapeake Bay. After days on the open water, suffering from frostbite and dehydration, they were spotted and rescued by a Union gunboat, the USS Satellite, effectively returning to the Union on a captured Confederate vessel. In the end, 6 of the 14 escapees made it back to Union lines, having endured a life-and-death ordeal that lasted nearly 2 months. 8 men were recaptured and returned to prison, only to be finally exchanged in a prisoner swap in March 1863. The narrative would continue here, detailing the official recognition of the raiders, the creation and presentation of the Medal of Honor, the specific citation for each man, and the long-term impact of the raid on American military doctrine and popular culture, including the multiple films and monuments dedicated to the event. Chapter 9: The Highest Honor and the Nation's Recognition. The return of the escaped and exchanged raiders to the North in late 1862 and early 1863 was not the quiet end of a failed mission. It was the beginning of a national sensation. Their tale of audacity, capture, execution, and harrowing escape provided a much-needed morale boost to the Union public, fatigued by continuous battlefield losses. A new decoration for exceptional valor. The Union government had long recognized the need for a non-commissioned officers award, separate from the informal commendations often given to officers. On the 12th of July, 1862, legislation signed by President Lincoln established the Medal of Honor to provide for the presentation of 2,000 Medals of Honor in the name of the Congress of the United States to such non-commissioned officers and privates as shall most distinguish themselves by their gallantry in action and other soldier-like qualities. The heroism of Andrew's raiders provided the perfect, indisputable justification for the very first of these new military decorations. The First Army recipients, In a solemn ceremony in Washington, D.C., in March 1863, Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton personally presented the new Medals of Honor to the first group of 6 exchanged prisoners who had survived the chase. The first soldier to actually receive the Medal of Honor in person was Private Jacob Parrott of the 21st Ohio Infantry. Parrott was a young man whose small frame hid immense resilience. During his captivity and interrogation, Confederate authorities had subjected him to extreme torture, reportedly over 100 lashes with a rawhide whip, attempting to force him to reveal Union plans. Parrott endured the torture and never broke. Secretary Stanton was visibly moved by Parrott's ordeal and the collective determination of the group. He declared the raiders to be American heroes who displayed a spirit of desperate daring and an amount of indomitable energy which has rarely been equaled in the history of the war. The first 6 Army Medals of Honor were awarded to Asterisk Jacob Parrott, Private, 21st Ohio Infantry, Asterisk William Pittenger, Private, 2nd Ohio Infantry, the planner of the prison escape. Asterisk Robert Buffum, Private, 21st Ohio Infantry. Asterisk William H. Reddick, Private, 33rd Ohio Infantry. Asterisk William Bensinger, Private, 21st Ohio Infantry. Asterisk Wilson W. Brown, civilian recognized as an enlisted soldier, 21st Ohio Infantry, the engineer. As the remaining men returned or were exchanged, they, too, received the coveted medal. Eventually, 19 of the 22 men who participated in the raid were awarded the Medal of Honor. The 3 civilian participants, James J. Andrews executed, William Campbell executed, and William Knight, who failed to return for years, were not initially eligible but are forever linked to the legacy of the award. William Knight eventually received the medal posthumously in 1878. The monumental cost of courage. The raid was, militarily, a failure. 8 men were hanged and the crucial supply line was not severed. However, the price paid elevated the raiders' sacrifice into a profound moral victory. Their story of infiltrating enemy lines, seizing a major piece of industrial machinery, running a high-speed engine chase, and suffering martyrdom and torture became a template for heroic espionage in the American. Chapter 11. The Technical Terror of the Track. The great locomotive chase, lasting nearly 9 hours and covering almost 90 miles, was a logistical and mechanical nightmare for both sides. The speed and urgency pushed 19th century railroading technology beyond its limits, creating moments of acute danger that surpassed any battlefield risk. Running blind. The engineer's nightmare. William Campbell and Wilson W. Brown, the 2 primary raiders who alternately ran the General, were competent mechanics but were operating under impossible psychological pressure. Every action they took was a gamble against detection. Asterisk. The headway challenge. The most critical technical difficulty they faced was maintaining headway. The W&A was a single track line. Trains had to stop at specific passing points to allow opposing traffic to pass. Andrews had to memorize the entire official timetable. Any mistake arriving too early or too late, or mistaking a station, would result in a head-on collision. For instance, at Adairsville, they waited agonizing minutes, feigning engine trouble, allowing the scheduled southbound freight to pass, all while knowing their pursuers were mere miles behind them. Asterisk. The unbalanced load. By uncoupling the heavy passenger cars, the General was running with an extremely light load, which made the engine prone to wheel slippage on the damp, dewy tracks. This loss of traction meant a loss of precious boiler pressure and speed, especially on inclines. Asterisk. Braking and momentum. The trains of this era relied primarily on manual braking, brake shoes pressed against the wheels via levers and chains. Since the raiders only had 3 boxcars, their braking capacity was low. This was an advantage in running away, but it made stopping quickly to destroy track incredibly difficult, wasting time in slowing down and accelerating back up to speed. Fuller's recklessness, the Texas in reverse. Conductor William Fuller's desperate decision to run the Texas tender first was a profound technical risk. Asterisk. The tender, the car carrying the fuel and water, was not designed to lead. It offered poor aerodynamic performance and little protection. The heavy boiler and driving wheels were now at the rear, putting enormous, unstable force on the front 4-wheel truck. The engine could have easily derailed at high speed, especially on curves. Asterisk vision and safety. Fuller, standing in the cab, had severely limited visibility, looking past the massive tender and its piled wood. He was forced to lean out constantly, exposing himself to flying debris and the tremendous wind-whipped smoke and steam. Asterisk. The ramming. When the raiders deliberately dropped and set fire to a boxcar to block the line just north of Adairsville, Fuller faced an immediate choice: stop or ram through. Stopping would have cost him half an hour or more to clear the burning debris. Fuller chose to ram. Hitting the heavy, burning car backward at speed was a catastrophic risk. The sturdy iron frame of the freight engine absorbed the blow, pushing the smoldering obstacle off the track. But the collision speaks to the sheer technical desperation of the chase. Fuller was sacrificing his equipment's integrity for time. The W&A's success in stopping the raid was a testament not just to Fuller's spirit, but to the tough, over-engineered nature of the 1,850 seconds American locomotive. Chapter 12, The Crucible of Captivity. The capture of the raiders initiated a terrible period of legal wrangling, fear, and psychological torment that far outweighed the physical hardship of the chase itself. The military commission and legal precedent. The captured men were initially held in Chattanooga before being moved to Atlanta for trial. Their fate hinged on their classification. The Confederate authorities argued they were not belligerents, but mere spies and marauders, and thus subject to hanging rather than the rights afforded to prisoners of war. Asterisk. The key evidence, the fact that they were in civilian dress and had attempted sabotage behind enemy lines, rather than engaging in direct combat, sealed their fate. James J. Andrews' ambiguous civilian status made him the perfect scapegoat and test case. Asterisk. The defense. The defense offered by Confederate Colonel Shaler G. Hillier was perfunctory. The trials were political statements, not exercises in judicial fairness. The Confederate government, desperate to protect its logistical backbone, needed to show it would meet infiltration with the maximum penalty. Asterisk. The martyrdom. Andrews' execution on the 7th of June, 1862, followed by the hanging of 7 others on June 18th, established a horrific precedent. The executions were witnessed by large, solemn crowds, intended to discourage any future acts of Union sabotage. The 7 soldiers, including Private Parrott, who later survived, were present and forced to watch the hanging of their comrades. This profound psychological weapon cemented the Union soldiers' fear and fueled their later desperation to escape. The horror of the jail. The surviving 14 men were incarcerated in the infamous Castle Thunder prison in Richmond. While Libby Prison often gets more attention, Castle Thunder was the hellish holding ground for spies, deserters, and political prisoners. Asterisks, torture, and interrogation. The men were constantly questioned and threatened. Jacob Parrott's brutal punishment, flogged over 100 times, was documented as an attempt to extract the name of General Mitchell, the officer who approved the raid. Parrott, despite the excruciating pain and permanent scarring, refused to break his oath. Asterisk. The fear of the rope. The prisoners were forced to live in a near constant state of terror, knowing they were merely awaiting their next summons to the gallows. This psychological warfare was perhaps more effective than the physical discomfort of the prison. The raiders had seen their comrades die. They knew they were not immune. This fear was the immediate driving force behind William Pittinger's meticulous planning of the escape. Chapter 13. The North Star and the Path to Freedom. The escape from Castle Thunder in November 1862 was a calculated risk that relied on precise timing and sheer luck, offering the men a brutal passage back through hundreds of miles of hostile territory. The plan and the descent. Pittinger and his primary co-conspirators, including Wilson W. Brown and Daniel Allen, realized their chance lay in a chaotic period of prison activity. The plan was audacious: to use a crude rope of knotted blankets to scale the 40-foot exterior wall of the warehouse. Asterisk. The tactic. They waited for the moment when a minimum number of guards were on duty, and using a loose plank of wood and a strategically placed nail, they secured their blanket rope to the window ledge. Asterisk. The fall. The drop was perilous. Several men fell and were badly bruised or injured, but the sound of their soft landing on the muddy street below was muffled by the night's chill and the river sounds. they scattered immediately. A lesson learned from the initial raid failure. The odyssey of the escapees. The 14 men split into 7 pairs or trios, agreeing to travel north-northwest toward the Union lines in West Virginia and eastern Tennessee. Asterisk. The coastal route. The most legendary part of the escape involved John Woolham and Daniel Allen. They headed east towards the waterways. They found a small, leaky, abandoned flatboat. Using improvised oars, they navigated the treacherous, cold currents of the Chickahominy and James Rivers, and ultimately reached the vast expanse of the Chesapeake Bay. For days, they battled exposure and starvation on the open water, until they were spotted by the patrolling Union gunboat, the USS Satellite, in a truly cinematic rescue. Asterisk, the mountain route. The Pettinger and his group chose the harder but safer route through the mountains. They traveled almost exclusively at night, guided only by the North Star. They survived on raw sweet potatoes, stolen corn, and whatever meager rations sympathetic but fearful enslaved or poor white families could spare. The terrain was brutal, deep ravines, icy streams, and dense woodland. Asterisk, recapture. Despite their efforts, 8 of the escapees were recaptured after weeks on the run, succumbing to exhaustion, exposure, and the ever-present threat of Confederate patrols and bloodhounds. They were returned to Castle Thunder until the General Prisoner Exchange in March 1863. The incredible resilience shown by these men in the months after the raid ultimately served as the evidence needed for the highest award the nation could bestow. The failure of the initial sabotage became the success of a heroic narrative that inspired the North. Chapter 14. The enduring legacy of the great locomotive chase. The story of Andrew's raiders and Conductor Fuller's pursuit did not conclude with the final prisoner exchange or the Medal of Honor ceremony. It entered the realm of myth, securing a permanent place in American military history and popular culture. The Medal of Honor and the official citation. The act of awarding the newly created Medal of Honor to the raiders solidified their mission as an unparalleled act of heroism, despite its military failure. Their collective citation became the standard by which all subsequent actions would be measured. The official citation for the Medal of Honor, which remains in effect for the 19 recipients, speaks to the unique nature of their courage. Is greater than one of the 19 raiders to receive the Medal of Honor for action performed while serving in civilian disguise in a volunteer force, and who penetrated enemy territory, seized a railroad train, and attempted to destroy the communications and transportation links of the Confederate Army at Chattanooga. This citation is notable because it recognizes an act of espionage and sabotage, conducted in civilian attire, as deserving of the highest military award, an exceptional circumstance born from the necessities of a civil war. The lives of the survivors. The survivors carried the physical and psychological scars of the raid for the rest of their lives, yet most went on to distinguished careers. Asterisk, William Pittenger. Pittenger became a clergyman and lecturer, dedicating his life to recounting the raid. His book, Daring and Suffering, A History of the Great Railroad Adventure, 1863, was the first and most influential account, shaping the public perception of the event. He saw it as a moral victory and ensured the names of his fallen comrades were honored. Asterisk, Jacob Parrott, the first recipient. Parrott returned to the ranks and continued to serve until 1864, discharged due to disability from the wounds he suffered in prison. He later worked for the government, served as a constable, and lived a quiet life, often called upon to attend military reunions as the living symbol of the Medal of Honor's origin. Asterisk, William Fuller, the relentless conductor. Fuller was hailed as a Confederate hero and lived a celebrated life as a railroad man. In his later years, he actively participated in the reunions, often meeting the surviving raiders. His final wish was to be buried near the tracks of the Western and Atlantic Railroad, a testament to his lifelong devotion to the line he saved. He passed away in 1905. The enduring cultural impact. The compelling nature of the chase 2 iron horses locked in a life-or-death duel proved irresistible to writers and filmmakers. Asterisk, literature, and documentation. Pittenger's account was followed by numerous other books, including The Great Locomotive Chase by Russell P., shot in 1909, cementing the narrative in American history curricula and popular consciousness. Asterisk, monuments and memorials. The engine, the General, and its pursuer, the Texas, became permanent museum pieces, as detailed in a previous chapter. However, the most poignant memorial is the Andrews Raiders Monument in the Chattanooga National Cemetery, where the remains of the executed raiders are interred. The monument is a large bronze depiction of the General and serves as the grave marker for James J. Andrews. Asterisk film adaptations. The story translated perfectly to the screen, providing generations with an introduction to the tale. Asterisk. The General, 1926. Directed by and starring Buster Keaton, this silent film is arguably the most famous fictionalized account. Though its plot is heavily altered for comedic effect, it is a technical masterpiece and remains one of the greatest silent films ever made, popularizing the historical event globally. Asterisk. The Great Locomotive Chase, 1956. A Walt Disney Productions film starring Fess Parker as Andrews. This version, filmed in color, adhered much more closely to the historical record and introduced the story to a new generation of Americans. The legacy of the Great Locomotive Chase is one of contrast, a brilliant failure of sabotage, but an undeniable success in demonstrating the extraordinary dedication and courage of ordinary men in a time of national crisis. It remains one of the most exciting and historically verified true life adventures of the American Civil War. Please like, comment, and subscribe this channel